This lecture follows the developments of the Sumerians and Akkadians, with the cultures in the Middle East that would come to dominate the region until we will see the largest empire the world has seen up to that point, with the Persians. So today we will look at the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Neo-Babylonians, and then the Persians. Now, after we see the Neo-Sumerian state falling, there is 300 years of turmoil where we left off last time, until the Amorites from the Syrian desert to the west are going to reunite the area and the cities under one ruler and establish a new capital at Babylon.
By the time the Amorites consolidated power and established their capital at Babylon, we already have the emergence of stone stelae used to distribute laws, which would come in handy for the most famous ruler associated with such a stele and a law code.
At Babylon, we find that Hammurabi will become the first king of this newly established Babylonian Empire, ruling from 1792 until 1750 BCE. Now, Hammurabi is probably best known for his law code. Here, in the Stele of Hammurabi, we have one example of this law code recorded. At 7 feet tall and 4 inches high, in the Louvre, we have, on black basalt here, a series of cuneiform inscriptions along with a relief dedicated to Hammurabi and Shamash, the flame god. Now, Hammurabi will reestablish, after 3 centuries of turmoil, he will reestablish centralized government, in which all rulers in the Near East are now going to be supported by gods, as we see at the top here, not gods themselves. So we must, of course, ask ourselves, when individuals would see this in the ancient world, what gave Hammurabi the right to tell them what to do and to lay down very serious and strict laws? And the answer is presented to you at the top. The gods gave him the right. Now, the law codes are going to be in a cuneiform script on the front and the back of this essay. Now, there are 3,500 lines of cuneiform running from top to bottom, from right to left, just as you would read any cuneiform, and they are in several sections. As you can see, these different rectangular sections are going to be a law for each one. Now, at the very end, he's going to be glorified as a peacemaker, having established a uniform law and order across a vast empire. Very difficult to do at a time when we only had regional rulers, and thus could only enforce regional law.
The significance of the stele with the law code of Hammurabi is noted because it was looted by the Elamites, taking it to Susa after they took over. Thus, the symbolic power of the stele, which had the divine right and sanction to distribute justice here on earth by a ruler, was originally in the temple of the sun god Shemesh, shown here on the stele, originally set up in Sippur. This was made 2 years before the death of Hammurabi, when he declared himself a benevolent ruler and is going to claim the fruits of peace around his great kingdom that he was responsible for. There are over 300 entries on the Code of Hammurabi, and most relate to property and commercial matters. 68 do relate to domestic issues, and 20 deal with physical assault, some of the most famous known.
This would be the difference, as we would understand it today in America, between state law and federal law. So Hammurabi is establishing federal laws that are applicable in all of the various city-states in the Babylonian Empire. Now, perhaps the most famous of Hammurabi's laws would be the eye for an eye, or, as the stele states, if a man puts out the eye of another man, his eye shall be put out. This relates to physical assault and made its way into the Bible. However, most of Hammurabi's code relates to protecting property, hence to protecting those that own property. So for instance, in a next law, we're going to find if a son strike his father, his hand shall be hewn off. Hence, respect for a dominant patriarch who owns the property and the right of inheritance is going to be paramount in this civilization. Other laws are going to bring this even further into focus. For, one states, if anyone steals the property of a temple or of the court, he shall be put to death, and also the one who receives the stolen thing from him shall be put to death. Thus, of course, setting a great example here for what will happen if individuals steal from holy temples or political institutions. If anyone who commits a robbery and is caught, then he shall be put to death. Again, this is going to be a law prohibiting robbery. So again, protecting property. The same can be said for slavery, which was commonly practiced in the ancient world. For one is going to state that if a slave rebukes his master, then the master can cut his ear off, because the slave is property. And then finally, anyone who breaks into a house is to be executed at the spot where he effected his entry and is buried there. So we find that this is going to be a testimony to how protective the law codes are of property, whether that be human property and or one's domestic environment.
As is recorded on the stele, Hammurabi intends, quote, to cause justice to prevail in the land, and to destroy the wicked and the evil, that the strong might not oppress the weak, nor the weak the strong. Hence, justice is his primary motivation, being sanctioned by a divine entity here. The punishment for transgressions of these laws is based largely on wealth, class, and gender. Therefore, someone who is wealthy and male would not incur as strict and rough a punishment as a woman who was poor or slaves. Therefore, the wealthy have power in this civilization and system over the poor. Citizens have power over and are privileged over slaves, and men over women. This binary construct that was in thought.
Now here, why does Hammurabi get to lay down these very draconian laws from our sensibilities? And that is because the gods gave him the ability to do so. At the top, we find that Hammurabi is standing in front of a larger seated god named Shamash. Shamash is the flame-shouldered sun god for the Babylonians, who gives Hammurabi the ring of authority and the rod, right? The right to build here, builder's tools. And so once again, we have this judicial code passed down from the gods, in essence. We know, of course, that Shamash is a god because he is larger. He also is wearing the multi-horned crown on his head, and we have these flames coming off of his.
The specific presentation here of a ruler walking up to a seated divine entity is going to relate all of the Akkadians, where these mythological figures or monsters, the chimerical creatures we looked at last time, that were on cylinder seals, would be replaced by these royal presentation scenes as they become known. Thus, the seal's owner is shown worshiping a deity, assuring the god's friendly attention to that ruler. The same can be said here with a well-known trope and a well-known iconographic convention by the time Hammurabi sets up his stele 2 years before his death. The presentation of a divine entity seated with a sun above, we already noted, related to earlier Akkadian renderings on stele, like that of Naram Sin, where we have the dual suns showing the significance and divine presence of said power with this new ruler on earth. The hat worn by Hammurabi, as seen here, the wide-brimmed hat, was popularized after we have the fall of the Sumeria and the rise of the Neo-Sumerians we discussed. The dress that Hammurabi wears with the wide-brimmed hat, as well as the clothing that leaves bare his right shoulder, is going to be one worn and popularized by rulers in the Near East after the Akkadians. The composite view and the clarity of the gestures here, whereby Shemesh hands the right to rule, symbolized in the ring and the rod, to Hammurabi, who gratefully receives it and will carry out divine justice on behalf of this sun god, this flame-shouldered sun god, will be the model for the Egyptians, for their divinely sanctioned rulers as well. Turning to a civilization that resisted the Babylonians and the law code of Hammurabi, we have the Hittites to their east in Anatolia, or modern-day Turkey. We find that their capital would be at Hattusha and was thriving and at its peak in 1600 BCE. To set this in the chronological terms of the Near East and Africa, this would be during the Old Kingdom here in Egypt, leading into the New Kingdom when they would strike at the power in the north of, or Lower Egypt. And so this is going to be a civilization that brings to the Egyptians the single-axled chariot that was much more nimble and quick. They are mentioned in the 9th century BCE in the Bible by the Hebrews, who are talking about this great civilization after their collapse, because they are only tribes at the point that the Hebrews come in contact with them. Initially, though, the Hittite Empire would have stretched all the way across modern-day Turkey and would have led to the edge of Babylon and Egypt. At their capital at Hattusha, we have here the remnants of a great citadel or a fortified palace on this outcropping, for it was easily defensible by this location, hence why it was selected, and it's also the only good source of water in the entire area, the rest being quite dry with low precipitation.
Now, the walls are going to be made up of stone in the lower section, which is why they survive here today intact, while the upper section of the walls are made of brick, hence they washed away. This was a double-walled citadel, making it very difficult to penetrate the defenses, and so it was left unconquered for centuries. Now here is a reconstruction of what the city would have looked like, showing you that we would have had an outer ring of walls and crenulated towers for archers, these fortifications, but even if you were able to breach those outer walls, we would still have an inner keep, an inner section you would have to breach as well. And we will find civilizations such as the Assyrians will carry on this design. Now, at the entrance to Hattusha, we have the Lion Gate, which is going to become very common by way of decoration and of formidable terrorizing of visitors that we find in many of these cities. For walking into the main entrance, you would have to pass by these massive feline sculptures that are meant to be guardian figures and or terrify us and ensure that we will not, once again, bring any harm to the inhabitants of the city because it is protected by these divine beings.
These guardian figures were 7 feet tall and reinforced by the colossal scale of the walls behind them. They would ward off intruders, thus as apotropaic functions. They would protect the city and its inhabitants, the Hittites. Some of them were half man, half animal creatures, which they would have had knowledge of based on the spread of Sumerian ideas through cylinder seals, as we've been discussing, where we have animals that behave like humans or chimerical creatures that are half animal, half man. Now, like the Babylonians and Akkadians before them, the Hittite kings are going to lay their success in war and claim their success through war. And when they represent themselves, they are showing themselves as a representative of a divine power in life. Thus, in death, they become a god, which foretells, importantly, the Roman idea of the deification of the emperor's spirit. Now, in 1000 BCE, the Assyrians would then conquer their neighbors and would benefit from the weakening of the Egyptians and the Hittites and use this to their advantage to conquer the rest of these regions we've been discussing.
Now they're going to set up an empire that is the largest so far, reaching into the Hittite region, conquering Egypt to the southwest, making their way all the way over into nearly the Far East. So the Assyrians are going to adopt the same type of divinely ordained power structure that the earlier civilizations like the Sumerians and the Babylonians are going to also adopt. Now the first palace established is right near the heart of Assyria at Kalu. So Kalu is, like Husha, going to be built atop an outcropping, right? A high platform, like the Sumerians had for their ziggurats. Hence the palace is going to be in the same location as earlier temples, exalting this royal power and protecting it by way of a citadel. So here we have Ashurnasirpal II, which means Ashur is guardian of the air, building this massive temple and having it decorated for an opening establishment party.
The Assyrian battle strategy was quite ingenious and involved a type of psychological warfare not seen in the ancient world before. They would claim, for instance, that the civilization they wished to conquer had angered their primary deity, Ashur. Then they would claim they needed to suppress those that threatened the harmony that was given by the rule of Ashur. So they would go into and sneak into a city's temples at night, taking away the images of their gods. They would then spread the myth that the gods of their people abandoned them, or that they demanded vengeance. Then, after everyone had been told this myth and had seen that their statues of their gods were gone, thus abandoning them, they would sneak back in and place these votive statues back in the temples and have the people swear an oath to the gods and their new Assyrian king. Breaking said oath would require the duty of the king for them to kill in order to keep this harmony in place. And this strategy worked quite effectively and was quite ruthless. The palace that is established by the civilization at Kalu is going to be massive, the first one in the series, made of mud brick walls 5 miles long, 42 feet high. And with the opening of this palace and the inaugural feast, we have a banquet, we're told, where 69,574 guests attended in 863 BCE. This commemorated the dedication of this new capital and cemented the power of this new grand civilization. The walls would be covered and painted in low-relief sculpture, and as is common in ancient Egypt and elsewhere in the Middle East, the most common scenes would be those of war and hunting, as they would follow with the Muslims and the Islamic culture after that. The reliefs are going to be in museums today in modern-day Iraq and Syria, as seen here. The chimerical creatures that lead us through the gateway of the city with the 42-foot high walls are also chimerical creatures, guardians that are going to be the models for the Greek hybrids like centaurs or the sphinxes. The winged genie, or the Birdman here, with the winged helmet representing divinity, is one of those unique entities, these hybrid chimerical entities of the civilization. They would assist with the funerary rites, attending to the tree of life, as we discussed going back to the king's grave with the ram in the tree of life.
Here we have an example of that with Ashurnasirpal II killing lions, as we find the emperor himself is going to be demonstrating his prowess as a warrior and as a military leader by pitting himself against the king of the beasts, the most ferocious hunter in the Middle East. So here, a rather modest relief at 39 inches high. We're going to have the ceremonial hunt presented with soldiers behind a lion who has been shot 4 times already with arrows and about to be hit again in the head by the king, who brings back his bow for a 5th blow. Then we find that the chariot is driven forward to the right by a charioteer, who then is going to move over a lion who has already been bested and killed in this arena. Now, we know that the hunt here is going to be well orchestrated and controlled. We would not want to put the emperor in danger. And so we find that they're going to release only one lion at a time, and it's going to be surrounded by soldiers so that he can easily get away by chariot and or be protected by his men. Now, the organization of the relief is very interesting because it's going to reinforce the stability and the permanence of this ruler. Because even though we have a lion rearing up at a diagonal on the back of this chariot, threatening to eat a man, and while the man is going to be releasing a bow back towards the feral beast, and that we are moving forward, we are halting this motion. So right on the vertical axis, we have the charioteer looking right, and then Azurnaserpal looking left. And so we balance out the motion of the horses by way of the directionality of Azurnaserpal.
The chariot shown here, interestingly, is stolen technology from their neighbors to the northwest, the Hittites, who brought the two-wheeled chariot, displacing the four-wheeled chariot seen below in earlier representations like the Standard of Ur. Regardless, the scene of two horses mowing over a enemy in its path, while we have a spear or archer on the back and a driver, remain consistent all the way through the New Kingdom in Egypt.
Now we have here the ferocity shown of the lion, thus the valor and bravery of the king, because this ruler is pitting himself against the king of the beasts. So we find that lions are going to be associated with royalty and kingship all the way through the ancient era. It will be found on palaces decorating rulers, and even in images of the rulers themselves, such as the sphinxes in ancient Egypt. Following this, we have other episodes relating to war, with Assyrian archers pursuing enemies, recording an event that took place in 878 BCE, where Azurnaserpal's forces drive enemies into the Euphrates River. We know that there is an economy of storytelling here because we see this river that three enemy combatants have swam into. We see them in profile, but the river from above, with this torrential current. The two archers readying their arrows at the left to fire. They have already hit one man in the back, as you can see here, showing that they are losing this contest. To the right, we have a small palace. Obviously, the scale is going to be slightly off, and so the paramount interest here is in legibility. Archers firing at enemies swimming next to a formidable palace and citadel. Right, so this combining different viewing angles is going to ensure that we have more narrative information included in a smaller space. The next Assyrian ruler would build a new capital and move it to the northwest, next to Nineveh in Assyria. And this is going to be known as Dur-Sharrukin, and the citadel for Sargon II. So Sargon, as we discussed going back to the Akkadians, means the true king. So here we have this nickname adopted by another ruler, saying that he is in the same line as Sargon, having the same power, and also protected by the gods. He would build these palaces atop high platforms, much like the Sumerians would ziggurats and the citadels we talked about at Hattusha with the Hittites. He will cultivate on these palaces a merciless image, stating that the gods help him to subdue his enemies, and so we dare not go against him. As he states, I built a city with the labors of the people subdued by my hand, whom Ashur, Nabu, and Marduk, these are all Assyrian gods, had caused to lay themselves at my feet and bear my yoke. So just like Hammurabi and the sun god Shamash, we find here that Sargon II is going to receive the divine blessing and lead to the medieval notion of the divine right of kings to rule. Here, in a reconstruction drawing of the citadel of Sargon II at Dur-Sharrukin, built between 720 and 705 BCE, we can see the outer and inner walls leading to a ziggurat and the residential palace where the king actually lives. Now we know that the rulers in the Assyrian world related themselves to the gods quite closely, for they would build a temple complex right next to their throne room and residential complex. In this case, we have a massive ziggurat, 7 levels high, 18 feet each level, painted in different colors, white, black, blue, and red, with a spiraling ramp running around it. And here is a reconstruction, drawing attention to this area of the city, and drawing attention to the fact that the gods support this ruler. Now, in order to make it to the ziggurat and reach the king, we would have to move through the outer gates of the citadel with crenulated towers and archers to the inner section. Now, this inner section of the palace is going to also be guarded by figures known as guardian figures, and more specifically here at Dur-Sharuk, known as Lamassu. Now, Lamassu are going to be a very particular type of guardian figure which guards the entrance to palaces and cities. It is going to be a bearded head of a man on the body of a lion or bull. In this case, you can see the feet are of a lion, with the wings of an eagle and the horned headdress of a god, just like we saw with Shamash and these other gods, with multiple horns laying over one and another. Here, this is designed to ward off enemies. Being partly in the round, we're combining viewing angles so that we can see from the side 4 feet, but from the front there are 2 feet. So we really have 5 legs as we walk past these imposing figures that are meant to strike terror into the visitors to this palace, the citadel of Sargon II. So here is the one flanking the Lamassu, which is a lion body, and here we have a bull's body with hooves. So the combination, this chimerical combination of human and animal forms, was meant to communicate the power that is at the disposal of this ruler, and that he can very easily crush us with these supernatural forces. So again, look at the multiple horned crown with Shamash, and this is related to divinity, going all the way back to the Akkadians. So we know that this is a divine force that is threatening us. Now, the idea of having a bearded man, right, with horns on the body of a bull or an animal goes back to the Sumerians and this notion of bulls relating to divinity and kingship. So we find that bulls very often were shown with beards, showing that they are like the rulers who had beards. Now, the guardian figure is no different in function than what we looked at the Lion Gate at Hattusha, where we find that in a more chimerical fashion, in this instance, they still are both guarding the entryway to the city and protecting the inhabitants and the ruler. So did the lion at the Lion Gate at Hattusha actually have wings on it, making it also a chimerical creature? We do not know, but others do represent these animal-human hybrids.
The third and final palace of the Assyrians was founded at Nineveh, which is just to the west of Dur-Sharrukin and Kalu. Here we have Ashurbanipal, known as Ashur's creator of an heir, who ruled from 668 to 627 BCE, having this palace decorated with new hunting reliefs and those of war. Here we have Ashurbanipal hunting lions in a very familiar subject and style, where again the prowess of hunting equals the great warrior's success in warfare, where now we have an entire field of dead lions with arrows throughout their body, as the king fires forward now while his 2 helpmates and servants behind him stab at this great beast that leaps, that he is already wounded in the head. The controlled environment is still an enclosed arena, thus we're still glorifying the ruler by pitting him against the king of the beasts. Atac has actually argued that this formulaic scene that we find in the Assyrians and other civilizations in the Near East are actually atextual, that being they do not come from a specific story or myth, for instance. They are instead adopted from the Egyptians in their scenes of hunting, with chariots as they battle lions. Enjoying the spoils of war and a moment of leisure, here we have Ashurbanipal and his queen in the garden. This is going to be a low relief on the palace wall that was originally painted. It's an alabaster, 21 inches high, so just under 2 feet. Here we find one of the occasional scenes of palace life, with the king lounging on a couch and the queen seated at a throne being fanned next to him. On the trees to the side, we have the head.
Now, unfortunately, the Assyrian Empire is never secure, and so we find that this image that they project of merciless conquest and of military might is actually to thwart any possible rebellions in their vast empire. They do not have the manpower to support it, and so the empire disintegrates at the end of Ashurnasirpal's reign. Then we find the Medes invade in 612 BCE. Out of the ashes of the Assyrian Empire rises the Neo-Babylonians, who wish to recapture the splendor of Babylon, hence they name it the New Babylon. Now, they're going to rule a horseshoe-shaped empire from, again, Turkey to Arabia, to Mesopotamia, and to the Mediterranean. Now, it is here in Neo-Babylonian times that the book of Daniel relates the Babylonian captivity of the Jews who are kept there. Now, in the book, they are going to mistakenly identify Nebuchadnezzar II, who is listed, for the actual ruler Nabonidus. Now here we find that as the Jews are going to identify, Nebuchadnezzar II will build temples and make Babylon the hub of the empire. And we also find that he puts a great deal of resources into this trading hub, so there is great wealth here. And he makes one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Now this is going to be the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, no longer surviving today, but incredibly impressive to the ancients who visited it. Now it is going to be completed around 600 BCE, and the Greeks did see it, for they did call it one of the 7 wonders. It is built for Nebuchadnezzar's wife Amytis of Media, who was homesick for the flora of her homeland, which was much more green and lush than the desert where Babylon is located. So as an act of love, which is a rare instance in the ancient world, Nebuchadnezzar builds her this private garden retreat, a multi-terraced structure with plant life imported from her.
This city is also home to the Ziggurat of Babylon, or the famed biblical Tower of Babel, built around 600 BCE and dedicated to the dragon god Marduk. It was comprised of 17 million bricks and mentioned in Genesis 11, the 1 through 9, where the people supposedly are going to challenge the gods and wish to make it to their level, and so they were punished. Thus their tongues were confused, according to the Hebrews. This is going to go a long way, as the Hebrews saw multiple ziggurats and heard tell of them as stairways to heaven. Thus, as described in Genesis 11, these peoples were attempting to get closer to the heavens, and since they worshipped the wrong God and did not understand how they were challenging God with hubris, they were punished according to them. The question then becomes, for many scholars, why are there no Israeli monuments this time in the Middle East? Well, the simple fact is the Israelites are not even mentioned in the histories until the 9th century BCE, when the Old Testament is written. Therefore, they were a nomadic people and did not have permanent structures until we get to, say, the famed Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem.
Now, leading to the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, we have a processional way protected by the patron god of the city, Marduk, who was a dragon. Now here we have the blue crenulated towers that everyone would have to pass through, entering the city and ensuring that it was protected. Along with archers at the top of these crenulations, we also are going to find gods on the walls, also acting as guardian figures like the Lamassu for the Assyrians. So here the so-called Ishtar Gate, which is reconstructed in Berlin, we find that originally it would have housed or been located at Babylon. Now, this massive gate, which you get an idea of scale looking at it here in the museum, has the famed blue glazed brick and alternates between images of different gods in the form of animals. These animals will include lions and dragons. The lion represents the goddess Ishtar, for they did not think that lions with a mane were male. They thought that they were both male and female. And down below we have the rendition that they have in the Middle East of a dragon, Marduk, which is basically a snake with talons and horns on it. Now, this is going to be the patron god of Babylon and would have terrified individuals who approached. The same function holds true since the Lamassu, and the idea is if we transgress the rules, laws, and go against the ruler of the city, then we will suffer the spiritual and divine wrath of these beings. Following the Neo-Babylonians, whose empire fell in the 6th century, the Persian Empire would rise, taking its place, slowly becoming the largest empire in history, conquering Egypt in 525 BCE, and then by 480 making its way all the way to Western Europe. The capital is going to be established at Persepolis by the first Persian emperor who conquered this vast empire, ranging from the Mediterranean to India.
It would in fact be the Battle of Marathon in 490, and then the battle against the Spartans and the Athenians in 480 in the Persian Wars, that we have this east and west divide caused by the Persian Wars, where the Greek historian Herodotus would state that the Persians were hostile towards the Greeks, and thus they represent everything the West was not. Thus they were tyrannical and non-democratic. Leading to these events, Cyrus II, otherwise known as Cyrus the Great, who ruled from 576 to 530 BCE, founded the Persian Empire. He also freed the Israelites from Babylonian captivity, their religions, and established a stable government that would last for 2 centuries over one of the largest empires in all of history.
The great king who took credit for this massive accomplishment was Darius I, who reigned from 521 to 486 BCE. His son Xerxes will take over at that time. He would state in inscriptions that he is Darius, the great king, the king of kings, the king of countries, the king of this earth, expressing the wide dominion over which Persia ruled. Now, we do know that because of how diverse these religions, cultures, and languages were, that Darius had to be an excellent administrator to bring these various peoples together. He was tolerant of diverse native customs and let people keep their religions. All they had to do was pay tribute or taxes to the Persians, much like the system for the Roman Empire to come. Now, the capital is going to be moved to Parsa, as the Persians call it, or Persepolis, the Persian city in Greek, that is going to be renamed and called as such by Alexander the Great, who conquers it here shortly. Now, the great capital city is going to be built on a raised platform, much like we saw with the Assyrians and others. The 40-foot high platform elevates the rather flat terrain that we see around it. This palace, which was 1,500 by 900 feet as far as the ceremonial palace was concerned. The roof no longer survives because it was primarily carved of wood. But here is a reconstruction showing what it would have looked like, open to the surrounding environment with walls behind. Thus we find that there was little the Persians had to fear in their native city and land for hundreds of miles in all directions. Now, this is the entrance hall, which you must pass by in order to gain entrance to the king Darius and then his son Xerxes. And we must pass by the army of the 10,000 immortals, as they are called, the shock troops of the Persian Empire that struck fear into their enemies, because they would arrange themselves in phalanx designs, and once one is going to be struck down, another one, identically clad, would take his place. Therefore, it looked like there was an infinite number of them. Here we have a painted reconstruction showing that it was with encaustic, very brightly polychrome throughout. The audience chamber being open to the air because of the temperate climate and low rainfall, hence we have flat roofs here. Following Darius, we have Xerxes, who rules from 585 to 465 BCE, who adds a massive sprawling palace to this original platform. Here we find a relief where we find that Darius and Xerxes are going to be receiving tribute from various kings throughout their vast empire. Now, the Persian Empire would be the largest in history by 480, only conquered and supplanted by an even larger one under Alexander the Great in 330 BCE. Thus, we find that Greek ideas in the Western world will be exported throughout the known world. So next time we will continue on with Egyptian art and the openings of the pre-dynastic period and the notion of pharaonic rule.